Hi there! Today is the second episode in this series dedicated to talking about smaller portions of gaming history that had a massive impact. The company we're going to talk about today is Atari. Chances are, you've heard of them. They had a huge influence in the arcade spectrum and then bridged the gap between the arcade and your living room. I'm your host, Lord Knight Caleb Com.
And I'm your co-host, Tesseract Ede.
And welcome to the second Ready Go Gaming Show special.
The story of Atari goes all the way back to 1971 with two individuals, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. At this time, video games were only novel attempts at programming handed out between friends, or in some cases were games running on computers that were as large as a master bedroom. We'll be covering a vast majority of this in Generation's Pong Wars, so keep an eye out for that. One of the titles that arose during this time of game development would be Space War, made by a collective of programmers for the PDP-1 mini-computer at MIT. Bushnell, who had previously worked at an amusement park while attending college, was exposed to Space War and decided it could succeed if given the chance to become an arcade attraction. At the time, Bushnell worked for an electronics company called Ampex and had an interest in a traditional Japanese board game called Go. His hobby led him to meeting Jim Stein, a meeting that set many historical events in motion. Jim informed Bushnell that Space War was running on a PDP-6, and minds began working to make Bushnell's dream a reality. But one of the major shortcomings was, at the time, mass production of games, especially one for computers, which wasn't exactly a walk in the park. For starters, computers were massively expensive. A PDP-6 alone would cost almost $500,000, and microcomputers at the time were a quarter of the price. They were not at all sustainable financially. As time went on, Bushnell saw an advertisement for a newer microcomputer, the Data General Nova, which was roughly $4,000 in 1970. To adjust for inflation, this would have cost around $26,681 nowadays. Bringing fellow co-workers Ted Dabney and Larry Bryan aboard, the nameless team would begin attempting to bring Space War to the public in a much larger capacity. Bushnell and Dabney would invest $100 each into a partnership called Syzygy.
What a mouthful, huh? Syzygy is an astronomical term. It's the word for what happens when the planets align, which almost describes the issue at hand. The project simply was non-viable. The core talent of Syzygy lay in their ability to think outside of the box and effectively replace assets in their own way. With the combined efforts of Stein, Dabney, Bushnell, and Bryan, they were able to create custom hardware. This hardware was able to generate the same effects of Space War on one of the first commercially available arcade games. So they had a concept that worked, proof of capability, but nobody to publish it. Bushnell reached out to Ampex where he was employed. They weren't interested. All major arcade companies were based out of Chicago at the time. After all, it was the era of pinball. Luckily, Bushnell had a dental appointment, and while talking to his dentist suggested contacting a company known as Nutting Associates, who had released an electronic entertainment device known as Computer Quiz in 1966. Bushnell approached Nutting and was pleased to know they were looking for another major arcade game. The company had been manufacturing and produced what was called Cosmic Combat at the time. After many hoops, red tape, and testing of Cosmic Combat, Computer Space was born.
Computer Space was the start of a great time for Syzygy, but we left out a few key details. Most of the individuals previously mentioned left their jobs to join Nutting Associates. But in 1972, after the game was not exceptionally successful, and as Bushnell couldn't retain enough of the stake in the company, they decided to break free of Nutting. Instead, they sought to incorporate Syzygy, but not under that name. They rebranded using a term from the game Bushnell and Stein played many years prior, Go. Most of the slang in Go describes situations that are occurring. For example, eyes, which are stones that are fully surrounded. Hane, which describes a move that goes around an opponent's stones. There's a word that describes the possibility of winning, or holding a unit in contention, sort of like check in chess. Can you guess what it is? Atari. Atari was officially a company, and it was time for their next major move. this time taking inspiration from Magnavox's hot new tennis game on the first commercially available video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Bushnell, as an innovator, sometimes took inspiration too far, and this era of the company will be addressed in Generations Episode 1. What you do need to know is that Atari took inspiration from the tennis game created by Ralph Baer on the Magnavox Odyssey and effectively turned it into one of the most popular arcade games of its time, Pong. But once Pong as a standalone game was brought to the home market, it really pissed off Magnavox, leading to a massive series of lawsuits that almost killed Atari. Pong was a massive hit, primarily led by Alan Alcorn, and it set the framework for Atari's arcade division, and boy did they make some amazing games.
Some of the games you just saw were created by Key Games, a secret subsidiary that Atari generated to circumvent exclusivity deals. This continued until 1974, but Atari was so embedded in video game culture, when the relationship was discovered, no one cared. The arcade titles that Atari generated were simplistic in nature, but they provided millions of hours of entertainment for an entire generation. Overseas sales were pretty low, and if you wanted to play these games, you had to head to the arcade and sink coins into a machine until you got the score that you wanted. But what if you could take the arcade, shrink it down, and bring it home? The wheels were turning, and Atari had their next major step planned. Atari was notorious for acquisitions and leadership changes. They'd have an idea, try to act on it, and then realize, even as a successful arcade company, they just didn't have the financial resources to pull it off. Atari needed the support of nutting associates for Pong and Computer Wars. Their next idea was likely to be their most expensive venture yet, a flexible video game console that could play the entire library of existing arcade games. Codenamed Stella, it was the result of repeated attempts at combining cutting-edge, for the time, microprocessors. These would include attempts at using the Motorola 6800, the MOS Technology 6502. Eventually, Stella would end up with the television interface adapter. Now, you may wonder, what's the best way to make money quickly when you're well established? The answer? Sell yourself to another company, of course. In 1976, Bushnell would sell Atari to Warner Brothers for $28 million.
But then, out of nowhere, a new challenger entered the battlefield, Fairchild, with their Fairchild Channel F. And for the first time in a long time, Atari was at a disadvantage. This might have been the reason behind the push to get the funds as quickly as they did, seeing that Warner Communications fast-tracked $100 million to get Stella produced. A year later, the Atari Video Computer System would be developed. Priced at $199, almost $850 nowadays, the Atari VCS paved the way for bringing arcade ports to the living room, blowing Fairchild out of the water. From combat to adventure, tons of games were programmed, sometimes poorly, leading to an inflation of the market. But Warner Communications, as a business, was very demanding of their programmers. And according to ex-employees, they were bullish, belittling, and intimidating, leading to major departures of programmers. But from this exodus came a unique opportunity. 4 developers who knew how to program Atari VCS titles, Larry Kaplan, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, and Alan Miller, broke away to make their own games for the system. This pissed off Ray Kazar, the CEO of Atari, and led to a series of lawsuits which Atari lost. But from the legal red tape, Activision was born, the first official third-party developer. As time went on, Atari was leading the industry, even with Mattel's Intellivision and Magnavox's Odyssey 2. By 1982, they were poised to release the next iteration of the VCS, the 5200, resulting in a retroactive redesignation of the VCS as the 2600. The 2600 was the most popular console of the second generation of gaming, and many companies desired to program on it. US Games, Telesys, Games by Apollo, Data Age, Zymag, Mystique, Comavid, and iMagic all began creating games on the system. However, the market inflated, the value of games dropped nearly 75% of their total value, and the North American market effectively crashed in 1983. Many of these companies removed themselves from the video game market entirely.
Atari lost $500 million. The home console market was falling short. The computer market was falling short with the 8-bit computer. The arcade division was reeling from the financial loss of their final arcade title, iRobot. Ray Kasser resigned, paving the way for James J. Morgan to deal with the failing company. Atari realigned as Natco, New Atari Company, and things started looking up. Behind the scenes, however, the Atari board was preparing to hand the company off to various investors. In 1984, the home computer and game console divisions of Atari were given to Jack Tramiel, the creator of Commodore International, resulting in the rebrand of Atari to Atari Corporation. The arcade division was retained by Warner, but was rebranded as Atari Games, and inevitably ended up sold to Namco in 1985. A secret division of Atari that was working on phones such as the Eagle, Phony, and Telectra was passed to Motorola. But the history of Atari isn't finished, not yet at least. This was only the beginning, but that's a story for another time. Until then, let's take a look at a supercut of Atari arcade games. Let's go!
And there you have it. Atari really didn't generate franchises, but instead created experiences in history. They weren't afraid to ruffle feathers, step on toes, and inject themselves into relevance by setting the example. While they contributed heavily to the crash of the North American video game industry in the 1980s, they taught other companies what behaviors to avoid, what policies to incorporate to make a business successful, and how to make your product stand out.
Again, the story of Atari isn't done. They'll be coming back later in the series, episode 13 to be specific. We hope to see you there. We hope you learned a little bit about one of the most powerful companies in video game history. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, the Ready Go Gaming Show.